This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 10 of Season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, March 6th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. The March 6th Wardsman begins with a rather long obituary for Charles L. Hildreth. There were two men in Westford named Charles Lewis Hildreth. This obituary is for the older one, who was born in 1822 in Concord, New Hampshire. The other Charles Lewis Hildreth was born in 1879 and died in 1968. He is often referred to as Charles L. Hildreth II. The older was a grand uncle of the younger. Now to the obituary. Our community has had its full share of sudden deaths in recent years, but when word was passed about Friday afternoon, February 26th, of the death of our venerable and respected townsman, Charles L. Hildreth, it was a shock and surprise, for recently he has been in comparatively comfortable health. In the fall and early winter, he was seriously sick with heart trouble, and his physicians gave but little hope of his recovery. But the strong constitution and the strong will rallied, and of late he had resumed many of his former cares and the daily outdoor exercises in which he firmly believed. Friday afternoon, he started out to walk to the neighboring home of W.M. Wright, who has been in his employ for many years. This house was originally the home of his ancestor, Richard Hildreth, and the late Mr. Hildreth was one of the seventh generation to occupy these ancestral acres. When he arrived at his house, he complained of feeling ill and died before aid could be brought to him. Charles Lewis Hildreth was born in Concord, New Hampshire, October 9th, 1923, educated at the Academy in New Ipswich, New Hampshire, and removed from New Ipswich to Lowell when 22 years of age, and began to work in the Lowell machine shop as an apprentice, serving 3 years. He then became a contractor in the machine shop, which place he held for about 10 years. During the Great Depression in the iron trade in 1858, he became foreman of a Philadelphia firm, remaining 2 years when he returned to Lowell and became foreman in the machine shop in 1865, holding the position 14 years. In 1879, he was elected to the important office of superintendent of the, quote, big shop, unquote. These works are the largest of the kind in America, and Mr. Hildreth was conversant with the minutest details. During this period, he resided part of the year in Lowell and the remainder of the time in Westford, going daily in the summer to look after the immense business in Lowell, and at the same time taking a deep interest in the farm at Westford, where he made many substantial improvements. About 5 years ago, he retired to his Westford farm, building the beautiful and substantial home where his last days were spent. A few years ago, he built the picturesque log cabin at the summit of sightly Prospect Hill, which I believe is still there. These and the several other houses owned by him, the care of his large farming interest, and the extensive building of substantial stone walls occupied his time. While living in Lowell, he was closely identified with the Kirk Street Church and in Westford with the Union Congregational Church. He was its friend and benefactor, and its members will ever hold his name in loving memory. It was Mr. Hildreth some years ago, when this church was remodeled, who came forward with his sagacious and practical business ability and generosity and made possible many things that otherwise could not have been accomplished. Embodied in the report of the building committee on the church records is the following entry, and this next paragraph is a quote from that report. A report from this building committee would not be complete without mention of a self-elected member thereof, who has proved the most efficient member of the committee. When the contract work was well underway, Mr. Hildreth found what was being done and ordered the construction of an organ loft. From that time on, in building and furnishing, in adding finishing touches within and without and about the building, his kindly hand has constantly been visible, with excellent taste and with the end in view of the completion of the whole in a manner harmonious throughout and thoroughly adapted to the purpose of the building. He has steadily labored. The carpet, the pews, the decorations, the stained glass windows, except the memorial window, with numerous small items thoughtfully provided, are from his generous hand. Last but by no means least, the organ is from him and his daughter. Mr. Hildreth was married in July 1846 to Miss Mary M. Lovejoy of Nashua, New Hampshire. She died in Lowell, December 1st, 1889. Two children were born to Mr. and Mrs. Hildreth, Emily Frances, born July 11th, 1847, and Ella Francella, born December 12th, 1849. The latter survives him. Since the death of her mother, she has been her father's devoted friend, helper, and homemaker. The funeral was held from his late home Monday morning at 11 o'clock and was largely attended. A large delegation of friends from Lowell was present. Reverend Charles P. Marshall was the officiating clergyman, and he spoke wise and tender words of loving sympathy and paid fitting and just tribute to him who had lived his long life with manly strength and faithfulness. He also read from a beautiful poem entitled "He Gives His Angels Charge O'er All Our Ways," which was a favorite of Mr. Hildreth. The quartet from the Kirk Street Church, Lowell, rendered beautiful selections, the first an adaptation from Whittier's beautiful Our Master, and O Love That Will Not Let Me Go, and lastly, Abide With Me. And there's then a list of all of the people that gave various flowers for the funeral. The next section is called Banquet. The ladies of the Thimble Club held their annual cooperative banquet complimentary to their husbands last Saturday evening. It was at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Alfred W. Hartford, who made the very best kind of hosts and hostesses, and it was also a sort of housewarming for their pretty new home in which they have but recently become established. The long table extended the length of 2 rooms and was beautifully decorated with carnations and ferns. The place cards were of dainty white with a pink carnation fastened through with pink ribbon. The menu was one of the best that this group of housewives knew how to plan, and after it had been thoroughly and happily discussed, the evening was rounded out with games, music, and congenial sociability. The group of gentlemen who enjoyed this party with their wives were Edward Fisher, William D. Woods, A.W. Hartford, H.V. Hildreth, Oscar Spaulding, Leonard Wheeler, J.H. Fletcher, and invited guests were Mr. and Mrs. Thomas R. Fisher of Lowell and H.L. Wright and W.R. Taylor. Last but not least was the daughter of the household, Miss Hazel Hartford. Mr. and Mrs. Charles L. Hildreth II were much missed, but were detained at home on account of Mr. Hildreth's uncle's death. The next section is the Tadmuck Club section. The regular meeting of the Tadmuck Club took place in Library Hall Tuesday afternoon. The program was changed by the committee in charge from the reading of a Shakespearean play to an afternoon with the poet Edgar Allan Poe, whose centenary comes this year. It was interesting and profitable from the fact that perhaps many real lovers of poetry are not as familiar with this poet as many others. Miss Ruth Fisher read an excellent paper bringing out the real genius that he made evident in his comparatively brief and checkered life of 39 years. The paper was interspersed with readings from his poems. Miss Eva Fletcher read Annabel Lee, and Miss Edith Foster The Raven, while Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey gave a group of 3, The Haunted Place, My Dream, and one other. The next little item is called A Trio of Movings. It is early in the season of spring movings, but the change of ownership of the Fletcher farm has been the cause of considerable activity in this line during the past week. Mrs. Mary E. Fletcher moved on Saturday from the house at 62 Main Street that has been her home for 38 years into the house at 1 Leland Road, owned by Oscar R. Spaulding, recently vacated by Mrs. Isles and Miss Moran. On Tuesday, Mr. and Mrs. Walter J. Merritt moved into their recently purchased home, made vacant by Mrs. Fletcher. The last in this trio of movings are Mr. and Mrs. William Sutherland, who have occupied the west end of Mr. Fletcher's house. They expect to move into Mr. Drew's house, made vacant by the Merritts, the last of this week, depending upon the weather. The next section is the center. Harold W. Hildreth is in Washington, where he went with Company K, Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, from Lowell, of which he is a member, to be present at the inauguration. This was the inauguration of President William Howard Taft on March 4, 1909. The members of the Edward M. Abbott Hose Company No. 1 held their regular monthly meeting and supper at the Hose House Monday night. The company are planning to give a supper to the Chelmsford Company as a graceful return courtesy for the good time tendered them earlier in the season. This is to take place next month at the Town Hall. The supper Monday night was one of the best, and it is almost superfluous to add that it was much enjoyed by the 20 members, of whom every single one were present, also 2 guests. The committee in charge were Albert Haywood, Howard Ferguson, and Sebastian Watson. The name of the little daughter recently born on February 4th, 1909, to Mr. and Mrs. Edward Fisher is Esther Gardner Fisher. Mrs. William A. Prescott, who died last week on February 28th at her home in Carlisle of pneumonia, formerly lived in Westford. Her maiden name was Mary Charlotte Adams, and with her family lived in the house now occupied by Deacon Wright. She received her education at Westford Academy, and her contemporaries of that time remember her most pleasantly. Benjamin F. Day observed the 77th anniversary of his birthday Saturday of last week at his home in this village. He enjoys very comfortable health. Mrs. James Brow, who is spending the winter with Miss Luce, when going to the post office one evening last week, slipped and fell on some ice, cutting her face and spraining one wrist. Dr. Wells attended her, and while she is thankful her injuries are no worse, they have caused her much discomfort. The Luce house was at 25 Main Street and was actually right next door to the Dr. Wells' house at 29 Main Street, but it was just around this time that Dr. Wells bought the house, and I'm not sure he was living there at the time. Miss Olive Pine has been sick this week with seriously threatened symptoms of appendicitis. The next section is Forge Village. Edmund Orr is on the sick list. Edmund Hunt is suffering from a severe attack of the grip. Mrs. H.E. Randall is quite ill with a cold. Little Daisy Precious is at home sick with scarlet fever. Harold Cannell and Nellie Morton with measles, and many of the school children are at home sick, most of them under the doctor's care. I guess that's the sick list in Forge Village for the week. Miss Stella Karkin attended a very pleasant recital at the YWCA rooms Monday evening. The next section is called Drowning Accident. An exciting drowning accident on the mill pond of the Stony Brook near Westford Corner, that's the Brookside area, occurred last week Friday about 9 o'clock when Vincenzo Di Venuto, who works for the H.E. Fletcher Company, and his 12-year-old daughter, Mary, attempted to cross the ice from a point near the mill of Donald Cameron to their home in Westford Corner. The ice suddenly gave way, and the father sank into the water. The girl could have escaped, but went to the rescue of her father, and in a moment both were struggling in the water. Their cries for help brought Fred C. and William Edwards to their aid. With much difficulty and heroic effort, they succeeded in rescuing the father, but the girl was swept under the ice by the swift current. After the rescue, Di Venuto was taken to the engine house close by, and although suffering from the shock of the water and the death of his child, he rallied in a short time. The body of the little girl was recovered during the forenoon, about 10 feet from where it sank. The funeral took place from the home last Saturday afternoon, an Italian minister from Lowell conducting the services. Burial in the cemetery at West Chelmsford. Next is another obituary. Samuel Crossland died suddenly of heart trouble on Tuesday evening about 8 o'clock. He had been in good spirits during the day. After supper, he lay down on the couch, as was his custom. A sudden groan brought his wife to his side, who raised him up, and he expired in a few moments. He was 63 years old and a native of England. He was a veteran of the Civil War, having enlisted in Company G, the 192nd New York Regiment. He was a member of Benjamin Butler Post of Lowell and the Veterans Association of Westford. For several years, he has been carrying on a small farm in Parkerville on the Carlisle Road. Aside from this, he worked a few years on the highway in the quota of help in the road department. He is survived by a wife and 2 children, Christopher Crossland and Mrs. Johnson, both of Lowell. He was a quiet, unassuming, faithful citizen and laborer. The funeral took place from the residence Thursday at 12:30. Reverend Charles Marshall conducting the services. The next section is the About Town section. At the Unitarian Church last Sunday, a collection was taken for the Unitarian Association. An interesting letter was read from a private school in the mountains of Alabama, from which it appears that there are 100,000 white children in the state who cannot read or write. Among those being educated at this school are 3 great-grandchildren of the first President Harrison. Time, which is no respecter of persons, levels both up and down. Wallace Johnson is making preparation to stack ice near Burgess Pond. It would be well to remember that ice is not always nice at this time of year, and that rotten ice and drowning accidents go together. Wallace Johnson must have had the ice cutting concession at Burgess Pond, because he's mentioned every year as cutting the ice there. The next section is the town warrant. In this long list of itemized wants and bill of particulars, the report of the Finance Committee should be a sort of, quote, cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, end quote. That's a quote from Exodus 13:21. To guide the town to the nearest desired haven of a low tax rate. A few New Thought articles are in the warrant. The rest can be marked as usual. Article 41, to see if the town will appropriate $250 to equip the town with fire extinguishers, ought to pass. Article 42, to see if the town will move the fire building in the rear of the town hall to Parkerville and buy land for the same, ought to pass unless discussion proves that building would be cheaper than moving. Also, the article relative to grading around the Cameron School as a new building with uncouth surroundings is like an expensive silk hat with patched overalls to match. Some of the others that can easily be marked important will be reviewed in the next round. I might add that apparently the old fire building at the rear of the town hall was moved to the site of the Parkerville Schoolhouse, because it was once located behind the schoolhouse there. The next section is Graniteville. P. Henry Harrington, the well-known contractor, has been drawn to serve on the jury at the Superior Court in Lowell, commencing Monday, March 1st. When you were drawn for the jury, it meant that you could be called any time during the following month. So he may be called for one or more or none jury trials. The Democratic and Republican caucuses were held in Town Hall, Westford, Thursday and Friday nights, respectively. At that time, the different candidates were nominated to be voted on at the annual town meeting, which will be held on Monday, March 15th. That's the news in Westford for the week ending March 6th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website, museum.westford.org. www.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for the next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.